So they just told you that corporations in the stock market are more important than black people in this country. That's a fact.
One of the few things that Cenk is right about is that it's difficult to see things from a different point of view. He said multiple times that the most difficult thing in politics is to escape your own perspective. While that might be a slight exaggeration, it can certainly be difficult, and failing to do so can give you a pretty skewed view of what other people believe and what they're trying to accomplish. Ironically enough, Cenk is one of the worst when it comes to this. Cenk isn't just uncharitable to his detractors and his ideological opponents. He just takes for granted that other people share his assumptions, and from this, he draws some completely absurd conclusions. Take, for example, this thing he said about voting rights and the debt ceiling while he was on the Crystal Kyle and Friends podcast.
These morons. Okay, so first, they promised African Americans, we're going to get you voting rights. Remember Georgia? In Georgia, they're like, oh, get us these 2 senators. We're going to get you voting rights. It's originally called H.R. 1. It's our number 1 priority. I said, look, half that bill has a 0% chance of passing because it was anti-corruption. It was always a lie. They were never going to do it. The Democrats didn't want to do the anti-corruption parts. But the other half of the bill would have helped Democrats a lot because it just would have allowed more people to vote. It would allow not just more African Americans, but everybody to vote. But when they had a chance to lift the filibuster to pass it, they didn't. And now mainstream media will tell you, well, you can't lift the filibuster. Is that right? Because in the first 2 years, they did lift the filibuster. You know what they lifted it for? Raising the debt ceiling. Because that would have crashed the stock market and that would have hurt all their donors. So they just told you that corporations in the stock market are more important than black people in this country. That's a fact.
That is not a fact, actually. It doesn't even follow logically from the premises that Cenk lays out. Let's just consider the leaps in Cenk's logic that got him here. So, the Democrats said they were going to pass H.R. 1, aka the For the People Act. Cenk was correct that some of the bill was devoted to campaign finance reform, but that's not the part that supposedly specifically targets black people. So we'll leave that for another day. Let's talk about the voting rights provisions. H.R. 1 has a litany of reforms to federal elections, some of which aren't actually that controversial. For example, it has universal online voter registration for federal elections. 39 states in the Union already have that. That includes dark red states like Louisiana, Alabama, and Idaho. H.R. 1 also has things like automatic voter registration. That means that when you get a driver's license or a state ID at the DMV, you're automatically registered to vote, unless you opt out. Interestingly, there were also election security efforts in the bill, such as requiring paper ballots. Some of it was definitely more contentious. For example, there were provisions requiring states to allow for same-day voter registration and alterations to voter registration on Election Day. It would also have allowed for 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote ahead of time for elections when they'll be old enough to vote. Ayanna Pressley actually wanted to change the law so that 16 and 17-year-olds could vote, but that didn't get any traction. There were also some very divisive parts of it. Early voting would have been required for 2 weeks before Election Day. It dealt a blow to voter ID laws, requiring states with such laws to allow people without IDs to vote after signing a sworn written statement attesting to their identity. And perhaps, most contentious of all, the bill would have allowed for mail-in voting for anyone who wants it. Some states require a reason to vote by mail, and this legislation would have eliminated all of that for federal elections. Make what you will of the contents of this bill. Maybe you think these things are good. Maybe you think they're all bad. Maybe you think it's a mixed bag. The point of this video is not to weigh in on that. There's a lot in this bill that I didn't talk about, but I assure you, nowhere does it say allow black people to vote where they currently cannot, or anything like that. Of course, Cenk and people who like to throw around rhetoric like Jim Crow 2.0 know that there aren't laws on the books that literally ban black people from voting. It's that supposedly these efforts to ostensibly crack down on voter fraud disproportionately impact black people and other demographics. We'll come back to that later. For better or worse, H.R. 1 has not become law. While it passed the House, it wasn't even split in the Senate. Given that the Vice President, Kamala Harris, a Democrat, can break the tie, Democrats could have theoretically passed it. But, as Cenk pointed out, they didn't lift the filibuster that requires 60 votes to break it. and they didn't change the Senate rules so that they only had to do an up or down vote, like they do with budget items. So the Democrats didn't really want to pass it, or something like that. For what it's worth, the Democrats don't have support within their own caucus to abolish the filibuster, or grant exemptions outside of non-budgetary bills, which would effectively abolish it. If you can just grant exemptions whenever you want, what's the point of having the filibuster to begin with? I'm assuming that Cenk would say that if he were president, he'd get them to fall in line by fighting them.
Now, do you think I'm going to stop? If I'm president? No. They're going to give you voting rights, and it's not going to be a goddamn question. I will crush anything in my path to get that.
That just means that he would yell vituperatively from the bully pulpit. Cenk seems to think that that's the only thing missing from politics, and someone's failure to do that is a sign of corruption or lack of desire to get things done, or simply cowardice. As a quick aside, Cenk will never be president, and even he seems to have accepted it. A viewer wrote into the TYT main show, lamenting the hiatus of another TYT show called Old School, which is typically hosted by Cenk. Here's how Cenk responded.
Dirge says, I am really quite bummed about the Old School hiatus. I didn't know it was on hiatus. Cenk, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, it just is until I'm finished, because it's too hard to pull off otherwise. But don't worry, it'll be back.
He could mean one of three things by that. Either they're getting a new host, which if they were, why aren't they doing that now? Or Cenk plans on doing the show from the White House when he's president, which would be absurd in a lot of different ways. Most likely what Cenk means is that he has finally figured out that his presidential run is going nowhere and won't be around much longer. He's probably the last person on Earth to discover this, but better late than never, I guess. Anyways, even if you grant that stricter voting laws disproportionately affect African Americans, it's a pretty big reach to say that not abolishing the filibuster or granting an exemption for voting reform is indifference towards black people. Again, leaving aside the merits or demerits of any constituent parts of the For the People Act, not everyone accepts the premise that this does disproportionately affect black people. According to a comprehensive study conducted by the economists Enrico Cantoni and Vincent Pons, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, this narrative doesn't really hold up. As Cantoni and Pons write, U.S. states increasingly require identification to vote, an ostensible attempt to defer voter fraud that prompts complaints of selective disenfranchisement. Using a difference in different designs on a panel set with 1.6 billion observations from 2008 to 2018, we find that the laws have no negative effect on registration or turnout, overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. Overall, our findings suggest that efforts to improve elections may be better directed at other reforms. But even if we grant, just for the sake of argument, that these laws do disproportionately affect black Americans, Cenk's statement that Democrats care more about the stock market than they do about black people is not borne out by the facts that he presents. Let's take a look at the other side of the equation. What would happen if the federal government did fail to raise the debt ceiling? Well, we don't know for sure, as it's never happened. But most people in the know are pretty sure it would be disastrous. Cenk is partly right. The stock market would almost certainly crash. But that would be more of an indication of underlying calamity than it would be the problem in and of itself. I know Destiny has said that he believes that part of the animus towards finance and capital markets from the left is that they don't actually get them or how they work, and I would say that this is a great example of just that. But that's another video for another day. The important question isn't whether the stock market would crash, but why would it crash? If the federal government was no longer able to borrow money, it would not have enough money from taxes to pay all of its obligations. This necessarily means that certain people wouldn't get their checks. The only question is who and on what timeline. The federal budget for 2022 was $6.3 trillion, whereas the government's revenue from that year was $4.9 trillion. That's a $1.4 trillion difference that was made up by debt. So, in other words, nearly a quarter of the federal budget is financed by government borrowing. We actually have reached the point where the government can no longer take on more debt. But the feds have been able to meet their obligations through accounting tricks and moving money around. There's a time limit on that, though. Eventually, the government would run out of that option, and someone would get shorted a check. The government would have to choose who is getting paid and who isn't. Now, I doubt the government would stop financing the debt they already hold, as doing so would make interest rates skyrocket, And any future debt the government took on after the ceiling was raised would be way more expensive. In all likelihood, some people wouldn't get any or all of their government benefits. Given how much of the budget they take up, this would almost certainly include Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. You know who benefits from these programs? Lots of people, including lots of black people. What do you think black people would prefer? Getting their government benefits on time and paid in full, or it being slightly easier to vote? I'm guessing most would choose the former. So obviously Cenk didn't actually think much of this through. He had his conclusion and just barreled towards it, ignoring any evidence that might cut against it. And he does this all the time with all sorts of things, which is why he's so delusional.
That's a fact.